everyone, we're Crew. And guess what? Google Play Games is the official PC platform for Cookie.
There were several points during World War I where the Germans weren't doing half bad. At the start, they almost took Paris, ending the war before it even properly began. When this failed, the Western Front line still made it, but the Germans arguably continued to dominate all other European front lines until 1917. Despite an extreme population and industrial overmight from the Entente to the Central Powers, and the Germans only having 3 allies, 2 of which were lacking at best, by 1917 the Germans managed to collapse the Russians. Would they now be able to follow this up by collapsing the French in the West? No is the answer, because for one, US forces were... Bulgaria was the first to surrender. There were several... Today, we imagine a different scenario. What if everything went perfect for the Central Powers? We will try to imagine a world that results in the best outcome for Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and the Ottomans. And it's important that we focus on all 4, because this means that we cannot just have Germany overrun Paris, knock the French out of the war and end the war quickly. Such a war would just see Germany expand a little bit, but Europe would simply prepare for round 2. Germany and allies need to come out of World War I as the hegemons of Europe. So, to dive into the scenario, I want to restrict myself as much as possible in terms of the time frame, since the further back we start, the more opportunity we have to make it as easy as possible for the Germans to win. I want to keep it as much as our World War I as possible. But one change I do want to make is in the US election of 1912. Former President Roosevelt was squaring off against incumbent President Taft over who should get to represent the Republicans. The Republicans would choose Taft, causing Roosevelt to create his Bull Moose Progressive Party. This split in Republican voters allowed the Democratic Wilson to sweep the election. In fact, it didn't matter who the Democrats put up, they will win the election. And this brings us to the Democratic Convention of 1912, where the Democratic Party decided who would be their presidential candidate. Prominent nomination candidate instead. This was With that, preparation time is already over. A certain Archduke is shot and the dominoes start falling, as war is now certain. But before we get how I will let the Central Powers win, I want to debunk a common way others have done it. First, Western attacks should building up for in terms of infrastructure. In our timeline, it still took 3 years to knock out a giant. This strategy simply isn't going to work out for Germany, as some of you may expect. A related point is, what if Germany just doesn't invade Belgium? The argument here is that with
Sick of all the ads like this one? Just head to adskiller.com, click on Activate Now. Add
already decided that they were going to join the war. Perhaps it would be delayed but dominate the other great powers of Europe without getting involved. Even if Germany doesn't invade Belgium, fortifies the West and focuses on Russia, Britain is going to join the war and make things more difficult for Germany. Alright, so that's how we will not have the Central Powers win. So then what do we do? First off, we need to change Austria. They were simply unprepared for the war that was about to happen. When Franz Ferdinand was shot, Europe had quite some sympathy for the Austrians. But Austria did not quickly act against the Serbians. Instead, Austria deliberated, acted slowly, ensured German support, discussed some more, then sent an unacceptable ultimatum to Serbia, clearly designed to be a cause for war, which Serbia, in a surprise move, mostly accepted. And only then did Austria declare war, a full month after the actual death of Franz Ferdinand. Any sympathy the Austrians may have had long since disappeared by this point. To make matters worse, the Austrians were seemingly unaware of what kind of a war they were starting. While Russia, France and Germany were already mobilizing their entire armies, Austria still just called for a partial mobilization, believing the war to remain a regional affair. All of this was just an embarrassing diplomatic display from the Austrians, which we will need to change. Upon the death of Franz Ferdinand, we will have Austria act swiftly, declaring full mobilization and their intent to punish Serbia. Diplomacy collapses much quicker, and the world goes to war almost a month sooner. This benefits the Central Powers greatly, as Germany was way faster at mobilizing than Russia was, taking away valuable time of secret mobilization that the Russians used in our time. But we are not done with Austria yet, as they further misplayed the initial stages of the war. Expecting quick victory, they took an aggressive stance against Russia, only to have Russia counterattack and devastate Austrian lines in a defeat Austria-Hungary wouldn't recover from for the rest of the war. Under German advisement, the Austrians instead take up defensive stances, while awaiting Germany's success on the Western Front. Germany would march their armies into Belgium as Britain enters the war. Due to the earlier war, the Germans have much more time to push in France. While, as discussed before, I will not have Germany capture Paris and end the war yet, there are still plenty of changes we can make here. First, the Germans need to learn some respect. Their conduct in Belgium and northern France was simply terrible, especially against the civilian population. If there was any doubt to the international community who the bad guys were, these actions certainly didn't help Germany's case. Across the war, over 20% of Belgium's population died, was deported or left. 20%. The Germans need to conduct themselves much more respectfully against especially the civilian populations of occupied regions. Then, after the Entente stabilized the front line around Paris, the remaining flatlands to the sea became the center of attention, as both sides attempted to fill up the remaining space. This race to the sea is where the extra time bought from less Russian mobilization will help out massively. We will have Germany refocused on the race to the sea earlier, while the Entente was still focused on Paris itself. This could allow us to have Germany achieve major successes, at best reaching the English Channel. This has two main advantages over our own timeline. First, the Germans can start pestering English shipping through the English Channel. And, unlike our timeline, where Belgium held on in Ypres, Belgium is fully taken. Both of these facts reduce Entente morale. By this point, it's time to look at the naval war. Fact is, the German Kriegsmarine, while powerful, cannot stand up to the British Royal Navy, and they shouldn't even try. At best, they should aim for operations in the Baltic Sea against the Russians. But while the Kriegsmarine is not doing so much, we will have the German High Command realize the power of the submarine. During World War I, submarines did a lot of damage to the British, especially in the later portions of the war. But the issue was, America and other neutral states were complaining. So the Germans, periodically, toned down their submarine campaigns. This is why we wanted William Bryan to be president, as he would have a much weaker response to German actions. Despite any controversy, Germany mostly commits to their submarine warfare, building more submarines faster. By no means is this enough to destroy Britain, but it will absolutely help making them weaker and more willing to sign a peace deal later on. Alright, so with Bryan's in charge, the US will stay neutral for longer. But besides the US, there are a couple other important states to keep out of the war for as long as possible. Perhaps the most important of these was Italy. Whichever side they joined, it would cause a painful new front for the other side. Now there is one simple, yet humiliating way to keep Italy neutral for as long as possible. The Entente had offered Italy Tyrol, Istria and parts of Dalmatia if they joined the Entente. The only way to keep the Italians out is if Austria was willing to cede parts of their territory. This way, the Italians achieve most of their goals without having to risk a war. Especially with the better German performance, neutrality would be very appealing to Italy in this case. This would require extreme pressure from Germany, including promises of compensating Austria elsewhere once the war was won. But it is crucial in keeping the Italians out of the war. Slowly, Austria retreats and transfers territory over to Italy. Not everything yet though, to ensure Italy doesn't just take the free land and declare war on the Austrians anyway. By no means does this turn Italy into a Central Powers ally, but Italy will continue to bide their time, not picking either side yet, which is enough for now. Moving east, we have the Balkan. Once Bulgaria joins the war, the Central Powers will have no issue in running down Serbia, and Serbian forces leave into Greece and Albania. Soon, Albania too falls to Central Power forces. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so. Thank you. We now finally move over to the Russian front, where the Germans still achieve victories and the Russians retreat massively. From here, the eastern lines are temporarily locked in place as well. With the Austrians in a much better position and not having to worry about Italy in the south, holds the southern line much better. By the end of 1915, these are, roughly, the European front lines. By this point, the Ottomans had already joined the war, but it's difficult to think of what changes we could make. The Ottoman army and industry simply wasn't prepared for a sustained, total war. To make matters worse, the Ottomans were ruled by a clique of the Young Turks, who mishandled many aspects of the war while committing resources to horrific things like what they did to the Armenians. But in the small time frame we do have, there is simply nothing to change. In fact, the Young Turks were pretty much the only faction which wanted to join the Central Powers. When war broke out, most called for Ottoman neutrality. It is absolutely vital to have the Ottomans involved at all, as they did soak up millions of Entente soldiers. Militarily, the best we can do for the Ottomans is basically what they already did in our timeline. Threaten the Suez Canal by invading the Sinai, while trying to hold out as best they can against the Entente elsewhere, who are also invading through Persia. We will ensure that the Ottomans don't try to go on the offensive in the Caucasus at the start of the war, which frankly was a pretty insane idea. Apart from that, all the Ottomans need to do is sit there, not collapse, and soak up Entente soldiers until the Germans can win the war. This leads us to Asia, which, if we wanted to, we could simply ignore. For the Germans, it barely matters if they lose their Pacific holdings. So if you believe that what I'm about to say is too unrealistic, simply ignore it. But Germany could try to get Japan on their side, or at least neutral. Both would be relatively minor changes, but would slightly help the Germans. So, when war breaks out, the Germans accept a Japanese demand to transfer Qingdao over to them while moving their fleets away from Asia. This wouldn't be a major loss to Germany, as Japan could have easily seized the town itself. But Germany goes further in communications with Japan, recognizing Japan's special interest over China as well as the Russian Far East. The Germans also agree to hand over their Pacific holdings to Japan. All of this takes away any pretense for war that Japan has, allowing them to remain on the sidelines. This does, very much, require the Germans to swallow their pride and give in to the Japanese, which is a pretty unrealistic part, I will admit. Later, in 1916, when the war is still in Germany's favor, Japan may just join the Central Powers, focusing on defeating the Russians while attempting to not fight the British and the French as much as possible. With the Entente navies busy in Europe, they too don't have the resources to go fight the Japanese at all, and Asia just becomes a frozen front line. By this point, the war already massively favors the Germans, while, even under President Bryans, the US is starting to consider intervention. This is still a long ways away. Right now, the Russians are starting to buckle under the pressure, while France and Britain fail to open up another front anywhere. As the Entente force Romania to join, the Central Powers overrun them as well. Unable to handle the pressure, in late 1916, a revolution occurs in Russia and the Tsar is deposed. In our timeline, the new Russian government made a frankly terrible decision, choosing to continue the war while it was already clear that Russia was not going to win it. This would lead to another revolution and the Bolsheviks seizing power. In this timeline, we will have the provisional government of Russia realize this fact. Russia simply cannot fight on, and peace negotiations begin. In our timeline, via the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the territory that Germany demanded was enormous. But the Germans only did this because the Bolsheviks, under advisement from Trotsky, decided to no longer fight the Germans, but also to not sign a peace deal. This idea went about as well as you'd expect, as the Germans, without any Bolshevik opposition, simply waltzed into Russia. In this alternate timeline, Russia's negotiating position is much stronger. A Polish state is ripped away from Russia, a Lithuanian Belarusian state would be carved out, Romania would be expanded, and a Western Ukrainian state may be created. The Ottomans push into the Caucasus, and finally, and perhaps most devastatingly, Japan seizes parts of the Far East before Japan drops out of the war. This peace deal is way more beneficial to Germany than the extreme demands they made in our timeline. Many of the conquered territories, but especially Ukraine, required millions of German soldiers to establish and keep